Hi, welcome back for part 4 of the 871 After Treatment series. I broke out an old Cummins shirt that I had and I was digging through some stuff, and back in the 90s, if you worked at Cummins, they had something called the Quest. And it was the Quest for Service Excellence. And everybody there had to go through quite an extensive program, and you learned about the products and of the day and how to do better at service. I'll say this about Cummins. They were extremely comprehensive in their training of their technicians, and if you worked there and you wanted to take advantage of it, man, they would train you. So it was a great place to work while I worked there. Okay, so back to the 871. We talked in the last 3 parts about the after treatment underneath, and you know what the DPF does and you know what the DOC does. And the DOC's the furnace, if you will, right? Remember? And so how does it do that? Well, it has to have fuel to make that heat. So to get the fuel to the DOC, the engine uses 3 things. It uses the ECM to control the system. It uses a fuel block that is mounted on the fuel pump side of the engine, back kind of right behind the fuel filter and a little bit underneath that big fuel housing where the 4 solenoids are. It's kind of buried under there, but you'll see a good picture of it in a minute. And then from that fuel housing, it goes around the other side to some people call it a number 7 injector on the back of the turbo. We're going to talk about that injector next time. Tonight we're going to talk about that fuel housing that controls it and a little bit about the ECM controlling it. So let's get going. Okay, here's the after treatment fuel block on the ISX 871. It's bolted on the side of the engine a little bit behind the center line, starter side of the center line of the block, about 6 to 8 inches below the block deck where the head gasket would go. In another slide here, you'll see part numbers and some things, but it's always bolted in the same place. There's 2 ports on top, 1 on the bottom. The fuel lines are held to it by banjo fittings and rubberized washers to seal them. It's got fuel pressure wise, when it's working, it has the same fuel pressure that's in the IFSM. So the IFSM averages on this engine somewhere between 265 and 285 psi on fuel pressure. The average I see in here is around 270 to 275-ish. And on the top left is a fuel pressure sensor. That's how the ECM knows whether there's pressure in there or not. And then your other 2 solenoids, one on the back and the other one on the bottom front, they are the exact same part number. So you could swap them, and all they are is off on. And the ECM controls all of this, and this is what it uses to send fuel over to the doser injector when it's ready to. And this is what it uses to dump the pressure off the doser injector when it's ready to. The ECM also does a test at key on. When you first key on and you start the engine, as soon as the engine starts, the ECM will open the check valve and fill the housing and line with fuel pressure, and then it will shut that fill solenoid and immediately dump the fuel with the dump solenoid. And it looks to make sure the pressure went up to just about what it sees in the IFSM, because remember that has a fuel pressure sensor on it as well. That's the main system fuel pressure. And if it passes that, then the next test it does is it opens again and it shuts, but it doesn't open a dump. And it watches the pressure in that housing, and it watches for decay. By decay, I mean whether the fuel pressure stays in the housing or whether it starts to bleed off. If it bleeds off too quickly, it'll log a fault code on one of those, on that housing in general, and you got to figure out what the problem is. And usually the problem is the dump valve's leaking. So the ECM controls all of this. Let's go to the next slide. This is a view of that block from the top. You can see that there's two ports for fuel lines, and they are different sizes. And one port is fuel back to the return or the tank, and the other is fuel out to the doser injector on the other side of the engine. Now let's take a look at the bottom. So this is the bottom view. We're looking at the oil pan, from the oil pan looking up. And that port you see on the bottom, that is where the fuel is fed in from the IFSM, which is the large fuel housing on the side of the engine. Depending on the generation of the 871, that line might come from a couple different places. But at the end of the day, it's all pressurized supply fuel. Again, it's about 270 to 275 psi. And here's a slide you've all been waiting for. I've got the part numbers of the sensors 2 and 3 down on the bottom half of that block. You can see they're 530, 8314, and both of those are the same part number. And by the way, those are the current part numbers as of the making of this video. If Cummins changes the color on the plastic plug, they'll change the part number. If they change anything at all about that part, a stamping on it, they'll change the part number. But don't worry, because if this part number changes 5 times, if you give them this number, they will supersede it to the new part, okay? And these parts probably won't change that much more because they pretty much perfected them. And then the fuel pressure sensors up over on the left there, the 492, 1519. Up on top, you can see which ports go where. And on the bottom, that's our supply from the IFSM. And if any of these parts have a fault on them, the ECM will not allow the engine to regenerate actively. It could still do passive regeneration when you're out driving down the road. You know what that is because we talked about it. But it can't do any active regeneration if there's any faults in any of these parts. And there's many different faults you can have. You can have shorted low, shorted high, signal voltage low, signal voltage high. You can also have low fuel pressure faults. If there's something, say the line crimps and the fuel pressure is too low, it'll shut it down. So luckily the ECM gives us lots of good clues by fault codes of where to look and what to do. When you're monitoring one of these systems with Insight, I always watch when I do the startup. I start the data logger before I start the engine, and I watch the fuel pressure in here when the ECM does that quick check I told you about. And if I see when it does the second part of the test that it's leaking down quicker than I know that it should, and I mean a lot quicker, but it's still not logging a fault, I will actually change that part, because once it starts doing that, it gets worse quick. And if you let the guy go, he's going to lose his after treatment in terms of it won't be able to do an active regen for him. Now, if you do have faults on these parts or you can't maintain fuel pressure, only once have I had to change that housing. It's almost always valve number 3 that's the problem, the dump to return. Almost always that's leaking when you lose your fuel pressure too quickly. But you still have to check. I'm just giving you a clue to what I've seen. Okay, so thanks for joining me, and then next time we're going to talk about the doser injector itself.